All right, well, hello there, everybody. I hope that your days off around the Thanksgiving holiday are going well. I hope that you guys are going to get some good rest, you're going to eat some good food, and that you're going to be able to spend some time with family and be able to just be encouraged by one another. I would encourage you to take some time over the next couple days to just focus on the positives in your life and let the worries and the anxieties of everything going on outside of the four walls of your home just kind of fade away for a couple days. I know that's what I'll be doing, and I hope that you'll join me in that. So, we're not having in-person youth group this week because Wednesday night is the day before Thanksgiving, and, a lot of people are traveling, people's families are coming into town, so we wanted to give everybody kind of a night off. And so, I didn't want us to do nothing on Wednesday. So this video is not really a recap video. It's not a Sunday school video. This is just kind of a virtual youth group that I hope will be a benefit to you. Some of you may be watching this on your own, but some of you may be watching this with your family, with your friends, and just kind of seeing what God has to teach us this week. And so, I was thinking about for a while what I wanted to talk about. And, some of you may know that before I took this job, before I was the student ministries pastor at Emmanuel, I worked for a university, and my job was to help find people who wanted to go into ministry once they graduated, some hands-on experiences that would kind of help train them up as they were in seminary or even pursuing their undergraduate degrees. And so one of the things that we did was we worked with smaller churches that did not have pastors, who really just needed people in the pulpit on Sunday morning. We would send them college students to kind of fill that role on Sunday mornings. And we had a lot of churches that we worked with. And as a result of that, we didn't always have enough people to fill all the pulpits that we needed on Sunday mornings. And so I would go out and I would preach pretty much every Sunday in a month. And so I was pretty busy, but I was also writing a lot of sermons in that time. And so, those 2 years were kind of a whirlwind. They went by so fast for me. And so recently I just decided to revisit some of my old sermons. Just to see what I was thinking about, just to see, the things that I felt were important enough to preach on, and verses that were speaking to my heart. And, a lot of it was really good, kind of, going back. It was nostalgic in a sense, but I came across this one sermon that I had written and, re-examined the verses that I was talking about, and I just felt it was so timely for us. And so what I want to do this week is kind of reframe a sermon of mine that I wrote a little over a year and a half ago, and just kind of frame it as a youth group devotional, just because I feel like these verses are really beneficial for us. And so I hope that you'll be encouraged by them. So we're going to look at Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 18 together. And so as we look at these verses, I want you guys to think about, have you ever been in a season of your life where you felt like your ministry has been limited? I feel like a lot of us right now can feel that in the midst of COVID-19. But for me, I can also remember my first couple months of college, when I was a freshman at Liberty. And, I had been really involved in my youth group in high school and did a lot of serving, did a lot of kind of ministry-related stuff. Even I was involved in like a Christian club in high school. And, I had to leave that because I'm not a high school student anymore. And I had to leave my youth group because, I was moving out of town for school. And, I remember getting there my freshman year of college and just kind of feeling like, what do I do? Like all these ministry opportunities that I used to have are just not there anymore. I don't have a church here in town. I don't know people. Like, what am I going to do? I remember feeling kind of almost dazed and confused for a couple months, my freshman year of college. But, as time went on, I began to develop friendships that I still have today. I'm still a part of a group chat with some of my college buddies. We talk every day. We've had a lot of really cool opportunities to pour into one another's lives. I also got involved in on-campus student ministry. I was in student leadership and got to pour into the lives of a lot of guys on my hall. Eventually, I worked as a graduate assistant. Eventually, I worked as a youth pastor in Lynchburg, and a lot of really good service opportunities came along. But that time where I didn't really have anything, I didn't really know what God wanted me to do, while it was a little confusing and frustrating at times, I can look back and see that God was still working, that God was putting people in my life so that I could begin to form relationships that would blossom into ministry opportunities later on. And so what I needed to understand in that time was that it doesn't matter where God has placed you, that he can always use you to advance the gospel. And so this is a lesson that we all have to learn at one point or another in our lives as our surroundings and our circumstances begin to change. And that's really a lesson that if you had not learned that lesson by March of this year, you probably should have learned it by now. With COVID and everything that's going on right now, like, our situation has drastically changed. Life does not look the same way that it used to. For better or worse, our circumstances have drastically changed since March of this year. And so, we are having to learn how to do ministry in a different context. And this is something that the Apostle Paul certainly would have understood. As we look at the beginning of Philippians, we see that Paul is currently in jail. Most likely he's under some form of house arrest, where, he's not like in a prison, but he's in his home with guards surrounding him. He's not allowed to leave. And so he had been arrested for sharing the gospel with people, traveling from town to town. And now Paul is stuck in an area where his social interactions are very limited. So, Paul was traveling, he was preaching, he was in a new city every, couple months. And now he's stuck in his home. And if that is not relatable for you, I don't know what possibly could be. I think back to January, February, and there were so many things that I wanted to go do. There were so many experiences that I was planning to have in 2020. All of a sudden, back in March, that drastically changed. I was stuck in my house, for probably from March till August. Like, I was working, but I was not traveling to work. I was stuck at home doing everything virtually. And so while, I wasn't under house arrest like Paul was, I think a lot of us can feel that feeling of, I had all this stuff I wanted to go do, and now I'm kind of stuck. And so what does that look like for me? What is God doing in keeping me from going out and doing the things that I was planning to do? And so I want us to read these verses together in light of that understanding and in light of kind of the context of these verses. So let's look at Philippians. We're going to look at chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. It says, "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice." Imagine that you're a member of the Philippian church at the time that Paul is writing this letter. The man that you likely would have remembered as a traveling evangelist who came to your city and who helped jumpstart your church, the man who was likely responsible for leading you, your family, and or your friends to Christ, is now in prison for sharing the gospel. You likely would have been concerned for his safety. You would have been worried about him, and as preachers began to gather and attempt to tarnish Paul's reputation, the situation would have become even more alarming. So Paul's message to the Philippians in verses 12 through 18 is to advance the gospel of Christ regardless of everything that is going on in the world around them. So whatever has happened to us, good or bad, can be used to advance the gospel of Christ. Regardless of circumstances, whether in pretense or in truth, we have been given opportunity to rejoice in the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so this should lead us to ask, how can we be advancing the gospel in our own spheres of influence and in the midst of our changing circumstances? And so there are 5 messages that Paul wants us to learn from this passage, and we'll break those down together. The first is that sometimes bad things happen, but that these situations are an opportunity to make the gospel known to those who need him and to embolden the community of Christ. The second is that each of us are given particular sets of circumstances which we can use to proclaim and defend the gospel. The third is that the most important thing that we can do as followers of Christ is to make sure that he is proclaimed regardless of circumstances. The fourth is that no matter how Christ is proclaimed, his proclamation is something that we should rejoice in. And number 5 is that boldness in Christ should call us to preach, but we must preach out of love and not out of rivalry. So as we begin to talk about what each of these lessons mean for us, let's reread verses 12 through 14, keeping these things in mind. So it says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. I remember a few years back, there was a classmate of mine that was hit by a truck while she was trying to cross a road in Lynchburg. And this was a truly awful thing to have happen to anyone, and we all were heartbroken to hear about it. But as the weeks went on, God began to use this bad situation for good. She was an international student whose parents did not know the Lord. And when they flew into town to help her through the recovery, several of her classmates and various university staff began to share the gospel with them. And eventually her parents came to know the Lord. And so what I learned from that experience is what Paul is trying to teach us in verses 12 through 14. That sometimes bad things happen, but that these situations are an opportunity to make the gospel known to those who need it and who may not have heard it before, but also to embolden the community of Christ, to be an encouragement to people who do believe. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And verses like 1 John 1:5 tell us that God is light, that there is no darkness in him. We see that God is not the author of evil. He's not the one who brings suffering into our lives. That evil and suffering are a result of the fallen nature of man. They are a result of sin and are tools which Satan attempts to use to draw us away from God. But what verses like Romans 8:28 tell us is that for those of us who love God and who seek after his purposes, that God makes all things work together for our good. And this is what it means to have victory in Christ. That because of God's love for us, he takes the very thing which was meant to harm us, and uses it to make us more like Christ. What Paul wants us to understand from verse 12 is that even though he is suffering, Paul is using the situation to advance the gospel of Christ. Paul's imprisonment has actually led to the advance of the gospel in two specific ways. First, Paul's imprisonment has allowed him to share the gospel with his guards. Second, his imprisonment has actually emboldened the others to share the gospel. Paul understood that even though he was a prisoner, that he had a captive audience. The guards that were guarding his home while he was on house arrest were not allowed to let him out of their sight and were posted there day and night. Just imagine being one of those guards. Most prisoners are likely rude at best and belligerent at worst. And then along comes Paul, a man who takes the time to speak to them kindly and to pray for them genuinely. Sometimes we can convince ourselves that the current circumstances aren't right for us to share the gospel. That if we just had more money, if we just had more time, if we just had more influence, if we just had more knowledge, or even if we're being more specific, if COVID would just go away, that we would be able to share the gospel. But looking at these verses, that idea seems a bit ridiculous. Because Paul is sitting in prison hoping not to be executed or tortured, and yet he still shares the gospel with people. Regardless of our current circumstances, we have an opportunity to share the gospel with other people. And we shouldn't let troubling times keep us from doing the work that Christ has called us to do. While it would have been easy for Paul to sit around and mope while on house arrest, he did not allow himself to do that. Paul recognized that these guards had been placed in his life for a purpose and were in need of the gospel. He recognized that he had been uniquely situated to speak truth into their lives. And so the second thing that Paul wants us to learn here is that each of us is given a particular set of circumstances which we can use to proclaim and to defend the gospel. Let's look at this lesson through what we see in verse 12. Paul says, "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel." While many people who had heard about Paul's imprisonment would have seen it as a detriment to his ministry. Paul's a traveling evangelist and he can't travel anymore. So what's he going to do? That's going to hurt him. One could make the argument that Paul needed to be imprisoned for the sake of his guards, right? That Paul's imprisonment was of benefit to the men that Paul was able to share the gospel with, the men that Paul probably would never have interacted with had he not been imprisoned in the first place. And so for us, we can feel like we are imprisoned by our circumstances, right? We can feel like we're trapped in the world that we live in, that something needs to change. But it may be possible that God has you where you are for a reason, and that God is going to use your circumstances to give you opportunities to serve Him and to give you opportunities to share the gospel with others. And so, let's read that. Let's read verses 15 through 18, keeping this idea in mind that as Christians, we are called to see outside of just our circumstances and to fix our eyes on Christ. So looking at verses 15 through 18 again, it says, "Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice." So, the third thing that Paul really wants us to learn from this passage is that the most important thing that we can do as followers of Christ is to make sure that Christ is proclaimed regardless of circumstance. Paul understood that the primary goal of a Christian is to worship Christ and to make him known. And so this led him to share the gospel with his captors, but it also led him to rejoice in the proclamation of the gospel by his professional rivals. What we see in verses 15 through 18 is that during Paul's imprisonment, there were kind of these rivals of Paul who saw this as an opportunity to kind of become the new popular evangelist, right? That they were sharing the gospel with not the best intentions at heart, right? And that in their sermons, in their teaching, they were basically trying to say how much better they were than Paul. Some of them were probably even saying things like, Paul is in prison because of some sin in his life. That Paul is in prison because God is punishing him because he's not as good of an evangelist as me. And if you were a friend of Paul, right, especially if you're part of the Philippian church and Paul's your kind of church founder, Paul was the guy who shared the gospel with you, that would have been incredibly hurtful, right? And people would have wanted a response from Paul against these preachers. And what people probably would have been looking forward to as they read this letter to them for the first time was some kind of sharp rebuke, some kind of gotcha moment from Paul. But we don't get that here. What Paul instead says is, whether in pretense or in truth, I will rejoice because the gospel is being proclaimed. That, yeah, it's frustrating that these guys are speaking against me, but they're also speaking the gospel. And so while this may not be what I want, I'll take it. I'll rejoice because the gospel is being proclaimed. Many of us find it easy to complain about the world around us. We see others behaving poorly or acting out of envy and self-centeredness, and it's easy for us to get upset. Our first inclination is usually to demand justice or to seek to hurt them in the same way that they have hurt us, or basically to continue the exchange of hatred and anger, to let that snowball even further. However, the message that Paul has for us here is that rather than allowing rage to enter and consume our thoughts, that we should instead find reasons to rejoice in what God is doing in the lives of those around us. It's entirely possible that hearing about these rivals of Paul who were seeking to tear him down during one of his weakest moments reminds you of an experience in your life. Maybe it calls to mind a situation that you're in right now. And while it is good to demand justice in these situations, we should also be looking for reasons to rejoice. One of the easiest things for all of us to find joy in is that in spite of Satan's best efforts, the gospel is still being proclaimed. The proclamation of the gospel is something that can take many forms. Sometimes that proclamation is flawed, or it comes from a person that we generally disagree with. Sometimes the proclamation of the gospel happens in areas and situations outside of our control, or that make us uncomfortable, right? That, I think about, COVID right now. It's easy to begrudge and bemoan our circumstances. It's easy to get frustrated by all the rules, by the disinformation, by the confusion, by people that we know getting sick with this virus. It's easy to be frustrated, but I can take joy in the fact that God is still at work. The gospel is still being proclaimed. I've seen people come to faith in Christ in the midst of COVID-19, right? I've seen our church continue to grow, continue to serve, continue to be an effective light in our community in spite of this virus. And so while I wish that all of this would go away, I wish that we could get back to normal, I wish people weren't suffering the way that they're suffering right now, I still can find reasons to rejoice because Christ has given us the victory. And so, one more thing that Paul wants us to learn here is that no matter how Christ is proclaimed, his proclamation is something that we can rejoice in. And Paul does have a lot to say about the way that people preach in these verses. He's careful to commend those who preach out of love and to warn about those who preach out of envy. Right? Paul's not giving a pass for people to preach poorly in these verses. Right? I wouldn't want us to walk away from these verses thinking that it's okay for us to preach out of envy or to preach out of rivalry. Right? That's not what we're supposed to walk away with here. And I know that I've certainly seen this before. I've seen plenty of pastors and speakers say something along the lines of, no one else is going to preach to you like I will, or that our church is so much better than that church down the road. There's a lot of pressure that comes with ministry. There's a pressure that comes with leading the church. But our job as a community of believers is not to compete for success, but to share in it. To come alongside our brothers and sisters in Christ and to work to advance the kingdom, regardless of what church we happen to attend or congregation we're a part of. And so this is what Paul is talking about in verse 18, when he says, "What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice." Paul's use of "what then" in verse 18 uses the Greek phrase tigar, which in modern American way of speaking essentially equates to "what does it matter?" Right? Why are we getting hung up on this? Paul takes the time to address the fact that there are preachers who are preaching out of rivalry, and he even takes time to condemn those actions. However, Paul follows it up by saying that even though there are people seeking to oppose him, that it does not matter because the gospel is still being proclaimed. That because Christ is being proclaimed, he can rejoice. And so the last thing that I want us to kind of think about here is that boldness in Christ should call us to preach, but we must preach out of love and not out of rivalry. Right? Paul wants us to be bold. He wants us to be bold enough to be willing to go to prison for sharing the gospel, and to be bold enough to share the gospel with our jailers while we're there. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, Paul calls Timothy to preach the word. Now, Paul asks for the boldness to preach from Timothy and from us as well. But in that same verse, Paul points out that some need to be reproved, some need to be rebuked, and some need to be exhorted. The message there is that we must be bold enough to preach, but that we should also be careful to preach well, right? To preach the right message to the right people. And the message here in Philippians chapter 1 is very similar. Paul commends those bold enough to preach, but he only praises those who are willing to preach out of love. Boldness was not something that was lacking among the early members of the church. From almost the very beginning, people were willing to die for their beliefs. And the willingness to become martyrs is what stirred many who did not believe to seek out what the church was all about. That it was, there was this thought that why are people willing to die for this? Maybe it's something that I should look into. That boldness is of benefit to the church. But we also must be loving in the way that we live out that boldness. We may think that we are living a proper Christian life because we're being bold. We feel a sense of pride in our boldness, and our boldness to stand counter to what culture says about morality. But we need to be equally concerned with how well we love. Be bold in the way that you live out your faith, but take care to also be loving. There are things that we can get hung up on that we should be bold about, but we may forget to be loving at the same time. Be bold in your rebuke of sin, but be loving in the way that you interact with sinners. I want to be clear that taking stance on issues that we should be bold about is a good thing. I'm not telling you to stay silent about issues that run counter to biblical truth. It's not wrong to be bold. In fact, boldness is something that we should desire and that we should pray for. However, if you're bold enough to say that you love Jesus in a world that wants you to love yourself, then make sure that you're living a life that signifies your love for Christ. So as we think about these things, I have just a couple quick discussion questions for you all. And this is a time for you guys once we've talked through these discussion questions, for you guys to pause the video and to discuss what your thoughts are on these topics. So, one, how can we be sharing the gospel in our own spheres of influence? Two, what perceived hindrances in your life may be giving you new opportunities for ministry? Three, how can we be advancing the gospel during COVID-19? Four, what positive changes have you seen in the world around you or even in the church as a result of COVID-19? And five, who has God placed in your life so that they can hear the good news of the gospel from you specifically? So I hope this was beneficial for you. I hope there's some good discussion that flows out of this. And I look forward to seeing you in person next week.